very much, and thanks for the invitation to join you here. Very alarmed looking at the program and realising that I'm the only genetically pure bureaucrat on this show. And I'm going to express my genotype in three ways at least. First, by disclaiming responsibility for anything I'm about to say, to the extent that you can discern any coherent view in it. It is not that of my organisation, nor barely of myself. Secondly, I'm going to retreat into the abstract. I'm going to talk in vague generalities and metaphors, but I want to open up a dialogue for how we can plug those metaphors up with solid fact. And thirdly, as a bureaucrat, I don't know what time of day it is, so just if I just throw something at me or just walk out if I overstay my welcome. But I have been intrigued by the ethical overlay, the ethical terms of the debate about intellectual property in the life sciences. And this work I'm putting forward is partly based on some discussions, some cooperation we did with the United Nations Interagency Committee on Bioethics. Not out of any abstract theoretical interest, but just because the issues come up again and again and again in the policy debates, in the legal debates, on a whole host of questions: health, food, environment, human rights, etc., without any common lexicon, any common way of working through these materials. And so, really, this afternoon is a kind of a reflection on that situation and an attempt, without committing myself in any way to any substantive position whatsoever, an attempt to at least create some kind of workable framework to think through these issues. So, to me, the essence of the paradox, for anyone working in the paradoxes already, I'm going to touch on a few, is this oddity of we have overall inclusive rights, thinking of the broader human rights domain. Nobody's excluded from the right to health. But one tool we choose to advance those rights is an exclusive right, the very character of an IP right. Its legal genus is a right to exclude. That's what it does. So how do we resolve these questions? And I want to look at some of the debates, the way that the issues are framed in the international sphere generally. This is kind of me in sort of group therapy mode, stepping outside my day job. This is kind of what we go through during the day. You have two models of IP policy making, if you like. Zero-sum trade-off. This is there is a balancing, but there's a thumb heavily pushing on one side of the balance, and there are winners and losers, and ultimately a zero-sum logic. Or a more idealised idea that, there is a net gain for all, that it is a means of collectively engineering how knowledge is created, managed, diffused, made use of, in a way that is overall fair, legitimate, equitable. That's obviously an idealised form. Now, if you go to the actual practice, the only equation I'm going to offer, if you go to the actual practice of policy making in the international sphere, it is, you would say it's absolutely zero-sum. No question about it. If you look at the way the debates, the processes that lead to laws and treaties, the processes do seem to be a very close mapping of the contentious drafting processes that are dominated by a zero-sum logic. There are winners and losers. And even the case law that we've heard about, Chakrabarty, Bilski, these are contentious cases. Patent law, a lot of the most interesting patent law is not prepared by an academic symposium, but hammered out in contentious forums where there are winners and there are losers. Your patent is upheld or you lose it. And this predisposes you, when you do as I do, sit on the podium and listen to the debate, to a kind of Wimbledon model of the ethics of intellectual property. That well, yes, well you're right. Oh no, you're right. No, you're right. Well, and if we look at the specific debates that we have, it really is without. I mean, each one of these is in itself a seminar paper, but this is really to illustrate the range of issues that even in my work currently at the WTO, previously in World Property Organisation, WIPO, these are the kind of zero-sum interests that are asserted or claimed or at least argued about, and really it is very much this Wimbledon model, backwards and forwards between these differing antinomies of interests, exclusive categories of interests that are asserted, and you are, however you like it, you are inferred to be on one side or the other. You're implied to be on one side or the other. These are the debates that really dominate what's going on, certainly in Geneva. And it becomes, some of the debates are interesting. I'm not trying to minimise these debates. The debate about traditional knowledge and the appropriate protection of traditional knowledge, for example, is a wonderful vantage point to really look into the assumptions, the cultural assumptions we make about what is the kind of innovation, what is the kind of creativity that we validate or privilege through the IP system. So, this is not to diminish these kind of distinctions, but sometimes it does become very crude. I mean, either you're for patents or you're for patents, and if you say anything that suggests that patents might have some vague social utility, then you are comfortable with people dying. And sometimes it really gets to that kind of fever pitch. And more generally, we see a construction in terms of user rights and producer rights, the rights of the producers of technological information and the users of that, even though that really does not map into what most people do in the real world. And if you think about innovation structures and the way the IP system manages them, I guess there is a kind of Manichaean tendency to look at two distinct ways of looking at the world. One is a public domain, publicly funded model, no exclusivity of right, no tainting yourself with the market, and then the hardcore private sector models, tight, vertically integrated exclusive rights, total reliance on market forces. And we tend to construct the debates, say in the life sciences field, about this. So in the red corner, John Sulston, in the blue corner, Craig Venter, for example, and so on. And the debate continues. And from an ethical point of view, we tend to favour one over the other. It's kind of ethically more likely to be approved. If we look at what actually happens in terms of actual processes that lead to actual outcomes, in terms of new medicines, ways of developing, applying, integrating life sciences into workable products that possibly could benefit us in a concrete sense, we see this cluster, this diversity of different approaches. The idea that there's a pure private sector or a pure public sector approach to product innovation and dissemination, especially in the life sciences, food, health. It simply does not map what goes on in the real world out there. That leads us to this suggestion that the zero-sum approach that does need to be revisited, and we need to think about how we can construct a way of looking at policy making in the IP field, which is indeed more than a sum of these parts, that does represent an integration of these diverse spectrums of interests, and indeed to get away from these black and white, these monochrome views of the world, to look at the nuance, to look at the diversity of interests, and to see, how the policy-making process can be a process of integration, of accommodation beyond zero sum. And that's what the process is meant to be about. It is rare to see people asserting, at least at a theoretical or a policy level, that IP rights exist in their own right, are ends in themselves, and are justified simply by virtue of their existence. It's typically in a broader social economic welfare context that we advance the claim that certain IP rights should be recognised, and that should be trite, but that certainly is the objective. And this is the paradox, that we are working with a system, developing, reforming, adapting a system with the goal of ordering and producing certain public goods, public knowledge goods, but also quite concrete public goods such as new medicines, with the intention that this should promote overall welfare and not simply the top right-hand corner, the corporate interests in isolation. And that we do this by crafting exclusions from the public, by in a sense, cutting out the public from certain knowledge domains, with that conscious utilitarian approach. Now, such a scheme is never going to be ideal. It's never going to be achieved fully in practice. But I'm trying to address it in terms of the broader objectives, rather than necessarily making an empirical claim about its real world impact, the kind of issues we've been talking already. The interesting point we've reached now is that the legitimacy, the value of the system is increasingly being measured in empirical, immeasurable terms, partly because the data are more accessible, are more usable. But there's a shift in the way even the human rights dialogue, or even the bioethics dialogue, takes place. It's less in terms of abstractions, and more in terms of direct utilitarian measurable terms. So your success in implementing the right to health is measured in terms of access to medicines. Who's getting medicines in practice? Not are there in principle legal restrictions that may impede access, but are people actually getting the material they need? And that's a much more pragmatic way of measuring human rights that is also affecting some of the bioethics debate too. So this is the essential paradox, the idea that we exclude, create exclusive rights in order to achieve inclusive ends. We make restrictions on the public domain in order to promote the public good. We distinguish the public good from the public domain, as it were. And therefore, as a debate unfolds about the nature of global public goods as a way of organising this discussion, at the global level, when we're talking about issues like neglected diseases, when we're talking about issues like adaptation and mitigation relating to climate change, when we're talking about food security in an environment under immense pressure, the debate turns to practical questions of how to provide the right infrastructure, how to harvest the necessary resources to generate and to disseminate public goods construed in increasingly practical or physical terms. Now this brings us to the considerations about the IP system. To achieve this, we do need to consider the IP lawmaking and policy-making process in a way that transcends this kind of zero-sum deal-making, that if you watch the process in action, you would imagine that that's the only prevailing ethic, that's the only prevailing negotiating logic. But we do expect, when the system is wound up and set free, that it is meant to actually do more than that, than just do minimum harm to both sets of interests, but rather to advance a common set of interests. And this idea of balance and equity, a positive sum, balance and equity, is measured or assessed both in terms of outcome and in terms of procedure, or as I've expressed it here, inclusion in access, in terms of access to the benefits, and inclusion in terms of process, inclusion in the actual process itself. Once again, the question of traditional knowledge being a very interesting example of the latter, in that the claim has come forward in the WIPO negotiations that any outcome would be illegitimate unless it had the active involvement of Indigenous peoples as part of the process of developing. No matter how legitimate the outcome may appear as an outcome, the equity of the process, the equity of the outcome is also assessed with reference to the process involved. Now this takes me very quickly onto the TRIPS agreement, which is, I think, remains a fascinating instrument if we step aside from the specific legal questions and look at the broader issues of law, policy and ethics. Because at the heart of the TRIPS agreement is a big should. This is Article 7 of TRIPS, which for the first time in an international multilateral legal instrument tells us, or purports to tell us, why we have an IP system in the first place. What's this whole apparatus meant to do? And that, if we take seriously that should, and once again I stress I'm not getting into legal interpretation, but taking it as a springboard for a broader debate, this should, there's a lot pivoting on it. Because above all, one reason we need instruments like TRIPS is to provide a robust, predictable way of settling disputes, because disputes do arise, and if the treaty system is unable to deal with those in a fair and predictable way, then it's not servicing its basic cause, basic purpose. There's a broader sense of legitimacy in that should, in terms of the breadth of the interests accommodated. It's very clearly signalling that it's not about the lone genius author or the single inventor, but rather the society's broader interests are factored in here. This idea of equity, legitimacy measured in terms of utilitarian benefits, but the idea is to advance social and economic welfare. And this idea that there's a hint here that effective domestic lawmaking would in some sense have to live up to this ideal or this objective. It's not a matter of just squaring different lobby groups. So if we take it at its word, this provision of the TRIPS agreement suggests there should be a balance of rights and obligations. There should be a mutual advantage beyond zero sum, and an overall utilitarian welfare gain, overall social and economic welfare. And this should is a tricky one. As I say, I'm just stepping outside of the thorny question of legal analysis. Treaty, what's the binding treaty language here? But let's look at it more broadly, because there are several kinds of should. Is this a reminder to us that this is a duty, that this is a good faith policy maker, legislator, is deontologically bound to seek to achieve these outcomes? Is it a more pragmatic utilitarian ethic here? Is it, if you get it right, this should be what results? Is it actually a legal obligation? Is there a sense that you've actually not implemented TRIPS unless you actually can have a measurable social and economic welfare gain? Is it simply aspirational? Is it say, well, look, with luck, if we get it all together, then we're going to have these benefits? Or is it in a sense predictive? Is it say, well, if you apply this whole set of tools, then this is what will follow? You can just, again, once reading it as kind of English and not legal language, you can get each of these nuances from it. But is this a kind of a heuristic for the policymaker? Certainly, I think it's indisputable that it's a good benchmark to work from, at least in attempting to set IT policy, again, beyond zero sum. So switching very quickly to bioethics in particular, we have a similar uncertainty when it comes to the should in bioethics, at least in the kind of the international policy debates. And the idea of an international sense of bioethics, a system of bioethics, is it about giving us determinations as to what is right and wrong? The exact point at which stem cell research ceases to be ethical or begins to be ethical? And who decides that? What's your ethical centre of gravity, as it were? What's your fulcrum? Or is it more a sense of a process? And this does seem to be what emerges in some of the soft law instruments that emerge. It's more about how you work, who you consult with, the degree to which you've obtained consent, and so on. So it's a judgment on behaviour, but only in terms of the procedure you go through, rather than an absolute sense of moral judgment as to whether this or that research is absolutely wrong. And we're also seeing a strong overlap between the bioethics discourse and the human rights discourse, which I won't elaborate on, but just to say that it does give it both a broader context but also a fuzzier context, and some uncertainty between the scope of what your bioethical obligations might be in an ethical sense and what your strict legal obligations to recognise human rights could look like. Now, switching to IP law then, certainly there's an ethical context for IP law, but it is not developed or implemented as an ethical measure in itself. It is, for example, there's no sense that it is unethical to make use of somebody's invention if it's not patented in your country. You just have to look at what the legal boundaries are. There's nothing unethical about using somebody's invention if they have badly drafted a claim, and it's too narrow that you think it would be nicer if people if they had a broader claim. There's no sense, I think, for most that it's unethical to infringe the ethical penumbra of a patent. It's a strictly legal matter. Nonetheless, there is a huge interplay between ethical considerations and the IP system altogether. The natural rights basis for IP law is not enormously fashionable in Geneva at present, and there's a much stronger trend to look at, in a sense, almost taking a lead, if not explicitly, from that TRIPS language, a utilitarian flavour very much entering the debate. So when we try to look at the interplay between this legal system and bioethics considerations, I found it helpful in discussion to make four very elementary, I suppose, distinctions, but these are distinctions that do get lost in a lot of the debate internationally between the ethical judgment you would pass on a technology as such, either what it is or how it was produced, the ethical implications of a national authority deciding to confer patent rights over that innovation, thirdly, your ethical choice, as it were, or the ethical implications of your choice to seek a patent on on your own invention. And finally, the ethical choices about how to exercise those rights once granted. You only have to look at some of the current cases where you see an uncertainty about which of these, or if all of these, might apply to particular cases. Is the concern about the stem cell research as such, the idea of fooling around with embryonic stem cells, or the idea that patent officers might take the ethically loaded choice of granting a patent on that material. The ethical question of, nobody's against the existence of mice, or unless domestically, they're in my house, but you might have an ethical objection to a patent on that same mouse. The ethical responsibilities of research institutes, quite apart from legal obligations, ethical obligations. If you are taking the public money for research, then clearly you're not in an ethically, utterly neutral context vis-à-vis the public. So there are ethical implications there of choices to take out patents. And finally, the ethical ethical dimension of licensing choices, for example, in the medical area. And we've seen a couple of examples already. The Parodonco mouse, where part of the concern is the infamous yuck factor. I mean, why do that to a mouse? Kind of thing. You're objecting to the technology as such, but equally you may be objecting to the patenting of such technology, either on the grounds that the technology, once again, is in itself unethical, or you regard it as unethical to patent life forms as such. And I nearly said BRCA, the BRCA case, which is I mean, all else aside, is a fascinating case study because it illustrates so many of these issues, in that a lot of the concern in the public debate was about a licensing model, in effect, with an ethical overlay saying, well, to some extent there was public input, there was, it's not, once again, it's not entirely in the top right-hand corner, not entirely in the bottom left-hand corner, and so that brings it an ethical dimension to it. And yet we see a recent case which looked at the patentability as such, and not directly at the desirability or otherwise of the licensing practice. And so we see these distinct layers of ethical consideration in a practical context flow into one another. But I think in terms of understanding the ethics and, for that matter, the law, we do need to consider them in distinct headings, recognising that they do have some influence on each other. So, thinking for the message for life sciences policymakers, I think it's an interesting example to take up the question of open source biotech, open source life sciences research. It's of interest in itself, but it's also an interesting case study because there was definitely a series of initiatives or proposals, urgings that this is what you should do, that another should, that open source biotech is desirable. And it's, once again, it's interesting to analyse the different kinds of should here. This idea that, well, I've heard these different arguments or rationales advanced at different times for the same kind of innovation model. Firstly, the old model isn't working, this is the only one that will actually deliver, so it's actually good for your interests. You in the top right-hand corner, you should sort of move across into the less exclusive zone, so it's actually prudential from your own point of view. It's argued that it's better value for your shareholders, so you'll keep your job. There's an ethical dimension to it that you can't possibly hog that right-hand corner. You are obliged as a moral agent to open up your toolkit. There's a broader social utilitarian argument in terms of how we structure even the patent system, how we determine the scope and the limits of rights. That if we are betting on on a system of exclusive rights that is meant to deliver public welfare outcomes, then this is the way to organise it from a broader society point of view. That's the argument. And a legal angle, and the example of the aviation pool is an example there where ultimately the should is just a legal one. So, well, the government has just said it's going to happen. So it's there's the softer ethical debate is off. So these are put forward just as an example of the way we need to unbundle some of these broader if you broader policy claims or broader policy urgings, and really disassociate some, or unpack some of the ethical assumptions that do drive these policy arguments. So to conclude, the two basic distinctions, which or the two areas that I think do need careful thinking through, and this I now become quite practical because I'm thinking of some of the debates at the moment about innovation, technology and climate change, about climate change adaptation, certainly access to medicines, innovation for neglected diseases, and access to key food crops. We do need to be clear about the ethical policy framework at the broader legislative treaty level, and to understand that it is, apart from a wordsmithing, a crafting of text that satisfies or at least quells all of these rivalrous interest groups, that it can be a positive sum game, and that's the art is to reconcile apparently divergent interests into a positive sum system. I do believe that is systematically achieved, not by no means perfectly, but certainly it is not often as bad as it may appear. And this does include consideration about how these exclusivities, how these exclusions are to be defined and governed. The pre-grant question, what from a policy perspective are the elements that can be excised from the public domain, as it were, for overall public welfare, and then the post-grant question, once those exclusive rights are released into the field, as it were, how are they monitored and managed and regulated? And to recall that it is not just a purely matter of just doling out absolute exclusive rights to those who are willing to pay for them, either politically or financially, but rather there are indeed open source ideas hardwired into the legislative system, and certainly there's nothing in the legal system that prevents that. And this is my final slide, because I do think this element is much overlooked, particularly at the international level, because we tend to legalise everything. We tend to assume that all of these questions, the Harvard Onker question, the BRCA question, can be resolved by crafting the right legislative language, or indeed crafting the right treaty text. And this tendency to push issues up into the stratospheric area of international law, whereas in fact so much of the welfare benefits or the welfare costs are the consequence of individual decisions that accumulate over time, that form patterns, and that's actually where the direct benefits or prejudices are felt. And so we do need to look at the ethical context, because that is a determinant of actual behaviour in many cases, and can indeed be more effective than pure legal interventions. So that's just some considerations based on the space in which I'm working at the moment. Once again, I said actually nothing of any substance, but tried to set out the basic framework within which we're trying to pack substance so as to ensure a more informed, more constructive policy debate. Thank you.
Thank you.
One question that I want to raise from something you said right at the end, you talked about legislative, and it wasn't clear whether that was legal or something different. But really legislatures very rarely intervene in this area. There's a certain tendency for them to say, oh, it's very complicated, let's leave it to the Supreme Court or the rest. But in a way, part of your message, I understand it, is that really there need to be public forums in which the public good, the voice of the public good, is somehow heard. But what's your view about the best kind of forum? I can't believe that it's legislature.
Well, I think in a way the issue is certainly too complex, certainly too important to be entrusted to any one forum. And that's one of the perplexities of working in the international system. There's an assumption that, say, climate change, which involves enormous debates about future innovation policy, how we collectively manage technology, how we're going to deal with the impact on agricultural systems, shifting disease patterns and so on. I mean, you cannot have a workable outcome that has legitimacy, has that political legitimacy, that does involve a sense of ownership on the part of those affected. You can't do that in one forum or another in isolation. You do have to have these big summits and these big political encounters, but you have to have a diversity of forums, because I remain convinced that the ultimate solutions are not found in beautifully crafted international law, not just, it can be very important, but in terms of individual decisions made at the ground level. So there's a kind of a food chain that we tend to wrongly put the international at the top and then the individual choices at the bottom. I would invert that and really identify that it's ultimately your choice about where you invest your money. You're going to pay a bit more money to install solar heating and so on. That's going to be far more important than whether the word is recognise or take account of in some international legal instrument. So all I'm arguing for is a recognition that these are not issues that can be solved in isolation, that it's fallacious and can be positively damaging to pursue that assumption. And there has to be a respectful understanding of the distinct roles of a diverse range of players at each level. I mean, that's trite, but it doesn't make it wrong.
John, Dan, and then the gentleman in the back.
Well, this is really just a comment, in support of what you were saying, and just reflecting on having worked on the history of medical technologies. By and large, if you work on the history of technologies, there's not much measure of success beyond the success of the firm. But if you're working on the history of medical technologies, there's a whole series of measures that you can work out, as it were, and compare the benefit to recipients, or the benefit to the potential recipients, or you could even, as it were, compare costs and benefits across national systems, for example, doing hip replacements. It's just to say that in that respect, medical considerations for all kinds of historical reasons are well advanced and may serve as good models for, as it were, normatising, as it were, some of the issues which we haven't previously done.
Dan.
It's a really fascinating framework for thinking about these issues, and I'm so glad that you unpack this notion of ethics. Apropos the question of the appropriate or effective forum in which these things might be addressed, the courts are obviously one, but the courts, at least in the United States, are forbidden from getting into ethical issues, even though in the European Union you can do that in intellectual property law under the European Patent Convention. When the Supreme Court ruled in Diamond versus Chakrabarty, the dissenters, the four who dissented, did not object in principle to the extension of patenting to living, or extension of utility patents to living organisms. What they thought was that this would be much more properly appropriately handled by the Congress. Congress obviously didn't do it, but at the time that in the late 80s, after the U.S. Patent Office announced you get a patent on a living animal, and then one was granted on a Harvard mouse, the first in the history of the world, the Congress did hold hearings under the Judiciary Committee of Congressman Kastenmeier, both in 1987 and 1989. And it was a very, very wide-ranging set of hearings. So if you haven't read them and you're interested in this, I commend them to all of you. They're publicly available, of course. And you see that all the issues that we're talking about were, except maybe the international ones, were raised there. Environmental, biotechnological, medical, ethical, and then all the interest groups were there as well. Church members, farmers, biotechnologists, physicians, farmers, etc. In the end, nothing came of it. Even though Kastenmeier, who represented the district at the University of Wisconsin, which spanned, he straddled the interests of the new biotech industry centered on the university on one side and the dairy farm industry on the other, he attempted to thread his way through and construct a kind of legislative program that would seek to at least make it reasonably equitable for both sides. And he proposed a farmer's exemption, a research exemption, and explicitly to say you can't patent human beings. His proposal, legislative proposal, passed the House but then failed in the Senate, and that was the end of it. And I mention all this because it seems to me that one of the things that you need to introduce into this framework of analysis is historical contingency. This would not have gotten anywhere and did not get anywhere in 1989, 1990 because, at least in the United States, we were moving into the heyday of entrepreneurship, innovation, and so on, which I've already mentioned. And now, 20 years later, we are seeing the consequences of that untrammeled commitment to entrepreneurship and innovation. In the case of, say, Monsanto, but that's just the poster child bad boy for these developments. So now we are beginning to see reactions against this sort of if you will, patent imperialism. And it seems to me that a new kind of movement is beginning to coalesce around these issues. And so that may be that the political forces or stars are aligning themselves so that we will see something actually happen, but without giving attention to the fundamentals of the political economy in the broad sense that undergird these issues, and whether the political economic forces together are willing to grapple with them, which they were not in 1989-90, except for Kastenmeier and some friends. You can't get very far with this, so that it has to be construed in historically contingent terms, it seems to me.
Well, I mean, you've just outlined a research agenda. I think I won't do it on my feet, but there's two particular angles I point to. One is the historical contingency, and I think TRIPS is a very interesting example of that, where essentially it was a negotiating ceasefire in approximately 1992. That was what the main players could accept, or had to accept. The deadline was there. And it has a few trailing edges, one of them in the area of biotech patenting, in fact, a review agenda that is still quite uncertain. But broadly, it has kind of crystallized as a more or less accepted basic benchmark for legitimacy, and the debate about TRIPS plus measures and so on gives it, in a sense, a retrospective validation as a sort of just a workable benchmark. And the second aspect of that is that it's been understood more and more to be, in a sense, just a treaty. It's not a moral law. It doesn't predetermine all of these sensitive considerations. It barely would have been considered in that in those congressional hearings, for example. Well, it certainly wouldn't determine the outcome. And we're seeing a diversity of experience in the way that countries choose to interpret and carry out their obligations, which in itself provides source material for a comparative analysis of ethical approaches as well. Because the famous policy space or flexibilities, legal flexibilities that sit side to side with the TRIPS obligations, these are also ethical space. These also determine how we structure relations between individuals in the state, the obligations you have to the public as a right holder, and so on. Clearly has an ethical dimension, and so that is not predetermined in the overall legal text, but it opens up that space. And I think we can learn just as much from that comparative experience, both chronologically, but also diachronically between we now have 120 countries that have implemented these rules in very different ways. We can learn a lot from that as well. And that's kind of vague with the research agenda.
And we have, for example, modifications like as in the Doha round.
We're going to have to stop there and let the conversation continue over ethically traded coffee. Downstairs. We're going to